Hello everyone, welcome back. I am Kris. This is Kings and Generals. This is the 5th video in the series, France and Spain join the Revolutionary War documentary. So before we get started, click that little thumbs up button like I just did. Yay! You can do that for me. That helps tremendously through YouTube. I don't know what it does, but YouTube says it's good, and so they tell me you should do it. Otherwise, they're going to start deleting accounts. That's what they say. Can't lie on YouTube. Second, you can subscribe and click the bell because YouTube says that's something that I should do, even though most of the people who watch my videos aren't subscribed to the channel. So that makes no sense. And then you can click on the thanks button and donate to the channel, request a video, and if you wanted me to do this video, which you can't now, but if you did, then I would say your name's, I'd say Kris Reacts, your name sponsored France and Spain join the Revolutionary War documentary. Okay? We're going to do this in one video. I was kind of looking ahead. This is a little jump we're going to make here, a couple minutes away, and then it's not the full part. So we'll just do it in one. All right? Elvis video.
America's shocking victory at Saratoga was exactly what French Foreign Minister Comte de Vergennes needed to offer an alliance. On February 6, 1778, in the Hôtel de Crillon, American and French representatives signed the Treaties of Amity and Commerce and Alliance, formalizing the existing diplomatic and commercial ties between France and the United States. More importantly, it established their alliance in the event of Britain declaring war on France, which Prime Minister Lord North obligingly did on March 17th. What had begun as an imperial dispute over taxes was now a global war. Most of that globe is in fact water, and in the modern era, control of the oceans became a decisive advantage, one that you too can now seize with our sponsor for this video, World of Warships Legends. It's a fast-paced and utterly explosive game of tight PvP naval combat, using the ships that made history in the modern era, from The Franco-American alliance was a nightmare for London.
Sorry, my thing's acting up. Okay.
Not since the 100 Years' War had England, or later Great Britain, faced France without European allies. Foreseeing the possibility.
Okay, I don't know what's going on with this thing. What are we doing? There you go. Excuse me. Could have muted the mic, but too busy. Okay.
That France and America might develop closer ties, London sent alliance feelers to every court in Europe in 1777, but returned without any success. Every major power wanted to see Britain humbled, and none of the minor ones were willing to do more than supply Hessians. Britain would have to fight alone. While the salons of Paris celebrated the alliance between the birthplace of the Enlightenment and the nation fighting for its ideals, the French court in Versailles had less lofty aspirations. While it fully intended to honor the commitments it had made to aid the Continental Army, American independence was not what France was actually fighting for. Rather, King Louis XVI intended to avenge and undo France's defeat and humiliation in 1763. An ideal outcome for France would be the full restoration of its 1704 colonial empire, but the realistic goal was to weaken Britain's position in India and Africa and gain as many Caribbean sugar islands as possible. France was not the only nation with a vendetta against Britain. Spain also burned to avenge the loss of Minorca and Gibraltar in 1704 and Florida in 1763, but was more circumspect. It was already engaged in a colonial war with Portugal and wasn't about to join in the American Revolution without proper preparations. Moreover, the Spanish king, Charles III, was also concerned about Spain's colonies in South America getting ideas from the United States and rebelling against him. Since the start of hostilities, Spain had been overtly supplying the Americans, first by opening Havana to American merchants, then by supporting the Rodriguez Hoteliers and Company operation. and finally by moving supplies up the Mississippi River to American traders. However, this was all the assistance it was prepared to offer. Even after entering the war under the Treaty of Aranjuez, Spain never fought alongside the Americans. Spain's priority was capturing the British fortress of Gibraltar, which sat right at their doorstep on the south coast of the Iberian Peninsula. While most of the Spanish military was devoted to that campaign, Spain still directed resources to the Caribbean theater. A campaign to reconquer Florida was launched from New Orleans, while paranoia of another British invasion of Cuba or Central America kept Spain's Caribbean forces on the defensive. France's strategy, meanwhile, depended on their rebuilt navy. Their defeat in the 7 Years' War had spurred not only an expansion of the French fleet, but also updates to their naval technology. Improvements and standardization of ship designs made construction and repair easier, with new masts and rigging designs making them faster and more maneuverable. While still smaller than the Royal Navy, the French Navy was once again a significant threat. However, its crews were inexperienced, and many officers were actually transferred army officers still learning how to sail. The plan was for the fleet at Brest to draw the Royal Navy's attention by challenging it in the English Channel. If the home fleet could be decisively defeated or another opportunity arose, then an invasion force of 40,000, already assembled in northern France, would be landed in England. If not, then it was to force Britain to keep as many ships as possible at home, allowing the rest of the fleet to operate more freely in the Mediterranean, African, Indian, and Caribbean waters. The operations in foreign waters were of particular interest to the Americans. The Continental Navy had attempted to widen the war through raids throughout the Caribbean, Canadian coast, and most famously, John Paul Jones's raids on Britain, but couldn't do enough damage to draw British strength away from America. Meanwhile, the entry of French naval power into the war forced Britain to rethink its naval strategy. Transporting, supplying, and reinforcing the American army had required most of its ships and personnel, leaving many squadrons and naval garrisons under strength. Worse, victory had caused complacency. While Royal Navy officers and sailors remained highly trained and aggressive, their ships had not kept up. There'd been no need to replace ships post-war, and much of the fleet was over 20 years old and outdated. Consequently, the First Lord of the Admiralty, Lord Sandwich, recommended the withdrawal of naval forces from America to Europe, for there weren't enough ships in Europe to effectively blockade the French and protect home waters. The Caribbean squadrons would be reinforced, with only the bare minimum of ships left in New York to keep supply lines open. Lord North only partially agreed to the plan. Lord Sandwich was allowed to withdraw forces from North America to reinforce the Caribbean and Europe, but not to his proposed extent. North had not given up on offensive operations against the colonies. Instead, he intended to change focus, which would require significant naval resources. The northern colonies had proven to be hard targets, but the southern colonies looked soft. Sparsely defended and populated, the southern colonies were considered hotbeds of loyalist activity, thanks to a high number of plantation owners tied to the British aristocracy. Thus, Britain would shift focus to reclaiming the South.
I would say that a lot of the South was plantation owners, so cotton, you have cash crops. Those items went north, but then they were sent to London. So the South, you would feel, would probably be a little more loyal. And it's more open. It's not as condensed as in like the bigger cities in the north. Like New York is more condensed. So you have a good chance of seeing a lot of Tories or loyalists as opposed to patriots, whatever you want to call them. So you have a little more freedom, a little more room to work if you go south, as you're more confined, and you don't know. The person next to you may pretend to be a loyalist and be on your side, but they could be a spy. They could try to kill you. You have no idea.
During the winter of 1777–78, Lord North directed George Germain, Secretary of State for the American Department, to forbid further offensives in the northern colonies and withdraw British forces towards the Atlantic coast and the Quebec border. 8,000 troops would be transferred from the American front to the Caribbean. Doing so functionally conceded that there would be an independent United States after the war. The only question was its size. Additionally, in early 1778, North dispatched a peace commission headed by the Earl of Carlisle. He was to offer the Continental Congress peace in exchange for returning to the Empire, under what would be called Dominion status in the 19th and 20th centuries. While Congress would have leapt at the offer in 1775, 3 years of war had pushed them too far from London to accept anything but independence, and the proposal was dead on arrival. However, that may have been the point.
I actually didn't realize. This is the first that I'm remembering that offer was ever made. Now, I could have heard it and just kind of blown it off like, well, that wouldn't work. But this is the first that I actually maybe am soaking it in, that there was an attempt. But it's too far along. And of course, the British are trying to do it because they're just trying to limit one war. If we can just end what we have with the U.S., with the colonies, the states, end what we have with them, then we can focus on all these others, you know. It was a good
North
attempt.
didn't tell the commissioners he'd ordered the withdrawal from Philadelphia a month before sending them, a move he knew would stiffen Congress's resolve. The humiliated commissioners wondered publicly if the peace offer was just a ploy, a question modern historians echo. Meanwhile, there was drama in the Continental camp. Congress was deeply frustrated with Commander-in-Chief General George Washington's battlefield failures and his decision to adopt a Fabian strategy. Horatio Gates's victory at Saratoga had won him considerable support, and Congress was struggling to pay and supply its soldiers and needed a swift end to the war. A loose faction soon developed under Inspector General Thomas Conway, seeking to replace Washington with Gates. Washington countered the Conway cabal by appearing disinterested and aloof from politics, letting his allies in Congress defend him. This strategy succeeded thanks to his opponents turning on each other. A subordinate outed Gates's distaste for Washington, and when confronted, Gates blamed then distanced himself from Conway, begging for forgiveness. Conway resigned in disgrace in April 1778, removing the immediate threat, but not the criticism. While this drama played out, the Continental Army suffered. The winter of 1777–78 was hard, and was made harder by supply problems. Its winter camp at Valley Forge was exposed to the elements and isolated, and many soldiers lacked sufficient winter clothes. Martha Washington ordered army wives to knit and sew blankets, gloves, and wool socks for the soldiers, but it wasn't enough. Despite many of the outposts being well supplied and sheltered, the men at the main camp suffered terribly, with over 1,000 dying of hypothermia and frostbite. However, amidst the suffering, there was a bright spot. On February 23, 1778, a Prussian officer claiming to be Lieutenant General Baron von Steuben arrived at Washington's camp. While in reality he was neither a general nor a noble, he was a skilled drill instructor. Washington desperately wanted a
very, 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 very underrated person in the history of the Revolutionary War for the U.S. I think he gets overshadowed because he claims this, he claims that, and it turns out it's not true. But what was true was he was a soldier, and he whipped these soldiers into shape, and he made them become better fighters. Completely underrated in terms of the whole outlook of how, even in the U.S., how we look at things. We put Washington up on a pedestal. Look, he was fighting a guerrilla warfare strategy. He wanted to go, British style, go shoulder to shoulder and line up and fire. And he realized we can't do that. And it's not about winning the war, it's about extending the war and making your opponent have to keep expending. And he realized what it was. He kind of changed the strategy in a way. But von Steuben does not get enough credit. That's just my opinion. Doesn't get enough credit for what he did to change those soldiers, because he made those soldiers, I think, realize that they were better, and he apparently used to cuss them out, and the soldiers were scared to death of him. And they also didn't understand him. He'd be cussing and screaming, and the translator would be translating, but not translating the cuss words, and just like, "You effing dumb idiot piece of garbage." And the guy was like, "Yeah, he just thinks that you should do better." Like, that was how he translated it.
A Prussian-style army, and von Steuben was happy to provide. Forming a model unit of 120 men drawn from every regiment, von Steuben drilled them relentlessly in Prussian tactics, particularly bayonet fighting, before sending them to train their home units. By June, Washington finally had the army he'd always wanted, and intended to use it. Meanwhile, British Commander-in-Chief William Howe resigned in October 1777, protesting the lack of support for his campaign, lack of recognition for taking Philadelphia, and unfair criticism for not supporting Burgoyne. His resignation wasn't accepted until April, leaving Henry Clinton to assume command, to both Clinton and North's chagrin. Clinton had fundamentally disagreed with North's policies and Howe's conduct of the war from the beginning, and had tried repeatedly to either gain an independent command or be relieved of duty. However, he was the only senior general left in the Americas after Guy Carleton resigned in protest, leaving him as the only option. Clinton firmly believed that any opportunity to win the war had been lost in 1776 due to insufficient troops, and that the best course of action was a withdrawal to the frontiers, using loyalist and allied native tribes to create a buffer for the more valuable Canadian colonies and limit the United States' growth potential. However, doing so was unacceptable to the British public and Whitehall, so his orders were to withdraw to New York as swiftly as possible and prepare the upcoming Southern campaign. Washington had planned to lure Clinton into battle at the earliest opportunity to restore faith in the Continental Army, but after learning of the Franco-American alliance, his officers advised waiting for French reinforcements. Washington agreed, directing his New Jersey Brigade and their militia to raid British supplies and scout British movements, maintain contact with Clinton, and keep Washington informed of their movements. Clinton's orders were to depart Philadelphia for the Delaware River and return to New York via the fleet as quickly as possible. However, the naval redeployment meant that he only had enough transports for half his army. Deciding that splitting his army was suicidal without extensive fortifications and naval support to protect those left behind, Clinton resolved to march overland, sending his heavy equipment and loyalist civilians to New York with the fleet. Washington received his first indications of Clinton's plan when Marquis de Lafayette's reconnaissance force at Barron Hill was almost captured by a British force several times its size. Clinton was actively seeking to prevent Washington from learning of the withdrawal. By June 18th, the evacuation was complete. Washington learned of the evacuation on June 17th, immediately calling a council of war. Only 2 of his 17 generals thought the Continental Army was ready for a direct confrontation, with Charles Lee saying that doing so would be criminal. Thus, Washington decided to follow Clinton on a parallel route, keeping close enough to strike if an opportunity arose, but far enough to prevent Clinton from doing the same. The New Jersey contingent was reinforced by Daniel Morgan's riflemen, and orders to make Clinton's march as unpleasant as possible. On June 24th, the militia reported that Clinton's march was slowing, but they weren't responsible for this turn of events. Clinton seemed to be lingering in New Jersey to provoke Washington to attack. That night, at another council of war, Washington's generals again advised against a direct confrontation, though his more aggressive generals advocated for a limited action against the British rearguard. Eager to expunge the previous year's defeats, Washington agreed and dispatched Lafayette the next morning. Lafayette was overly eager to fight and raced ahead of his supplies and the rest of the army, almost catching the entire British army before Washington recalled him. Lee was sent to Englishtown with reinforcements to take over command of the vanguard, now 4,500 strong. Washington gave orders to engage the British at the best opportunity, but left no battle plan since he didn't know when or where that would be. Lee decided to wait for Clinton to move first, hoping that his line would string out and allow him to pick off a significant group of stragglers in the June heat. Clinton deployed the Loyalist Queen's Ranger Company to screen his rear as he moved from camp near Monmouth Courthouse on the 28th. At 0800, militia scouts began skirmishing with the Rangers. Lee's troops arrived in time to watch the Rangers withdraw and waited for the whole vanguard to arrive before crossing the bridges to pursue. Finally advancing along the English...
just kind of popped into my head, but I believe, I could be wrong, it wouldn't be a first time. I'm about to say something and I'm going to look it up. My phone is just a text. It's not important. I believe the Queen's Rangers were, Robert Rogers was one of the Queen's Rangers. He was an American-born British subject. But the Queen's Rangers, I believe, are the origin story, so to speak, of the U.S. Army Rangers today. Now, I say that because I believe Robert Rogers wrote a manual. I'm sorry, I'm just double checking. Queen's Rangers, also known as the Queen's American Rangers, and later Simcoe's Rangers, were a loyalist military unit of the American Revolutionary War, specializing in cavalry tactics, close combat, irregular warfare, maneuver warfare, raiding, reconnaissance, screening, and tracking. Yeah. Ranger units originated during the French and Indian War, 1756 to 63, when the British formed special units of expert woodsmen and marksmen to range. Clicked on this link and now to range the force of scouting, screening, and harassing missions. During the American Revolution, both British and American forces employed Rangers. And then Texas Rangers are formation of that. And the National Park Forest Rangers. But they don't kill people. Don't you worry about that. But yeah, Robert Rogers and the Queen's Army Rangers were the reason, America wanted a force kind of like that. And so that was the start of it. I apologize. That just popped into my head, and it's one of those things that you've heard, and so you want to share or double check, and I just did both. So there you go.
Town Road, Lee attempted to envelop the British rearguard just past Monmouth, believing them only 2,000 strong. The British withdrew.
And also, side note, I've heard this before, I don't know if it's true, but the Army Rangers are pretty badass. They are sent to help Navy SEALs if they get in trouble. Navy SEALs are pretty badass. But if you have a unit that's being sent to help you, they're pretty badass too.
To the northeast, as their dragoons tried to delay the Continental advance. Lee and Lafayette were moving up to the Middletown Road to engage, but Lee neglected to inform his other officers of the plan or maintain contact with them. As such, when British reinforcements arrived to help the rearguard, the other columns pulled back to defensive positions in the woods. When his staff reported losing contact with their other units, Lee realized his plan was ruined. As the contact was reported, Clinton ordered Charles Cornwallis to return to Monmouth in force, not just to relieve the rearguard, but to destroy the Continental vanguard. Realizing the situation, Lee ordered a retreat to the west, which was only barely carried out after the staff officers desperately searched for the lost units. After reaching Kerr House, Lee began to unravel. When Washington's staff officers met with him to report back, he said he didn't know what to say and didn't provide any further information. Now panicked by British troops moving artillery onto a knoll overlooking his position, Lee retreated further across the Spotswood Middle Bridge, only in control of the units he could see. Having received no reports, Washington had not hurried the army's march, and was shocked when stragglers, then whole units from Lee's command, retreated into the advancing army without any orders or idea where they were going. Washington rode forward to find Lee struggling to organize a defensive line along the bridge. A furious confrontation followed, during which Washington rebuked Lee for losing control of his men and failing to give battle before riding off to personally organize the defense, leaving a confused Lee where he found him. Meanwhile, Cornwallis had pursued, with Clinton following, and his leading grenadier and guard units began engaging the Continental vanguard at 1300. By 1330, the Continentals had successfully withdrawn all troops and artillery to Washington's line on Perrines Hill. There they repelled a series of attacks before both sides settled into a 2-hour-long artillery duel. During the duel, more men fell to the heat than enemy fire, including William Hayes, whose wife Mary took over his gun position, becoming the nucleus of the legend of Molly Pitcher. By 1600, Nathaniel Greene had managed to flank the British left with his artillery, forcing Clinton to begin withdrawing. Washington ordered the army forward, engaging and pushing back the units guarding the retreat. Clinton ordered a phased withdrawal, but his orders were misunderstood, and the whole army began falling back. British counterattacks slowed but didn't stop the Continental advance before nightfall. Washington intended to continue the battle the next day, but Clinton would withdraw during the night and make it safely to Sandy Hook, withdrawing into New York.
Do you think Washington got mad that they retreated at night and he was just like, damn it? Oh wait, I did that, didn't I? Never mind, it's a good strategy.
By July 6th. In purely military terms, the battle at Monmouth Courthouse was indecisive and pointless, with Clinton completing his withdrawal as if the battle hadn't happened. Casualty figures are unclear due to heat casualties, and Clinton deliberately misreporting his losses to make it look like a great victory. But historians believe the maximum casualties for the Continental Army were 500 total to the British 1100. However, in the grand strategic view, Monmouth was a tremendous American victory. Clinton would never re-challenge Washington, and the Continental Army had at last proved that it could hold the field against the British. More importantly, Washington's leadership during the battle and Lee's subsequent court-martial removed the last challenge to his position. His critics silenced, Washington began building a ring of fortifications to contain Clinton in New York, with the linchpin being Tadeusz Kosciuszko's masterpiece at West Point. Meanwhile, back in April, the French had dispatched Comte d'Estaing with 12 ships of the line and 4,000 troops to America. After confused orders prevented a British intercept near Gibraltar, d'Estaing arrived at Sandy Hook on July 11th, missing his chance to trap Clinton. Sandbars convinced d'Estaing not to attack New York, to Clinton's relief, so instead he and Washington agreed to move against Newport, Rhode Island. Captured in 1776, Newport had served not only as a supply base for New York, but as a staging ground for devastating raids in Connecticut and Massachusetts. General John Sullivan had been unable to recapture Newport due to a lack of soldiers and supplies. With Clinton contained and d'Estaing en route, Washington sent Sullivan reinforcements under Greene and Lafayette. D'Estaing left New York on July 22nd, pursued by 9 ships of the line under Admiral Richard Howe. Arriving off Rhode Island on the 29th, d'Estaing and Sullivan planned to land the French troops, blockade the harbour, and then besiege the British garrison. Instead, Howe arrived on August 9th, and d'Estaing reloaded his troops and sailed out to seek Howe for battle on the 10th. However, a storm scattered and damaged both fleets. D'Estaing's fleet didn't reassemble until August 20th, at which time it was clear he had to return to Boston for repairs. Sullivan maintained his siege lines, hoping d'Estaing would return in time to launch an attack. However, by the 28th, he realized that staying was pointless and prepared to withdraw. The British attempted to capitalize, but suffered heavy casualties in ineffective frontal attacks. The Battle of Rhode Island was the last major engagement in the Northern Theatre, with the British abandoning Newport in October 1779 to free up troops for the Southern campaign. Peace had come for the North, but not the West. The American frontier had always been a perilous place, but the Revolution brought new danger. While initially reluctant to involve the indigenous tribes, by 1777 the British were actively arming friendly tribes and launching them against American settlements. This led to severe retaliation against indigenous communities perpetrated by American colonials. Following the Saratoga campaign, the British-aligned Iroquois tribes who left the Confederation had been attacking American farming settlements in upper New York and Pennsylvania. Using Fort Niagara as a staging ground, the Mohawk and Seneca launched numerous devastating raids and massacres alongside Loyalist John Butler's Rangers and smaller native contingents, with the worst occurring in Wyoming and Cherry Valleys. While militia and Continental forces burned native villages in revenge, by 1779, the damage done to Continental food supplies demanded a larger response. Washington was determined to end the native threat permanently, but tracking and destroying the war parties in the wilderness was prohibitively difficult. Instead, General Sullivan and 3,200 troops would march from eastern Pennsylvania into Iroquois territory, while another column moved up the Mohawk in a scorched earth campaign, destroying the raiders' supply lines and safe havens, before converging and taking Fort Niagara. At least 40 primarily Seneca villages were burned, and 5,000 indigenous peoples were displaced. However, the difficult terrain and skirmishing against native war parties prevented the planned attack on Niagara. Despite the devastation of the Iroquois heartland, raids would continue until the end of the war. Further south, Kentucky had been opened to settlement by the Treaty of Fort Stanwix in 1768, but the Shawnee had disputed the treaty, resulting in a low-level but persistent war between them and Virginian settlers. Beginning in 1777, the British at Fort Detroit began supporting the Shawnee, aiming to drive out the Virginians. In response, Virginia's governor, Patrick Henry, dispatched about 200 militia rangers under Lieutenant Colonel George Rogers Clark, later remembered as the Long Knives, to counter the threat. Clark planned to take the formerly French settlements in Illinois to use as bases to attack Detroit. Setting out from Kentucky on June 24, 1778, Clark traveled down the Ohio River before marching overland to Vincennes, taking the undefended Fort Sackville bloodlessly.
I've been to Fort Sackville. It doesn't exist anymore, but the footings of where the fort used to be is there. Now it's George Rogers Clark National Monument, and it was dedicated by Franklin Roosevelt. He showed up and dedicated it. And the day that I went there, they opened up the basement. It's a bomb shelter. It's a nuclear bomb shelter. And I got to go through it. And I didn't take any pictures. I don't know why, but I just didn't take any pictures. But it is really cool. The story of that, and then the story of how he takes Fort Kaskaskia, which is after this, and he comes back to Fort Sackville, Vincennes. Yeah, it's brutal because he has to. Spoiler: he has to retake the fort, and it's brutal.
The French-speaking population was won over by news of the Franco-American alliance and agreed to swear loyalty to Virginia. The other towns in the region quickly followed suit. Hearing of the fall, the British moved out of Fort Detroit in August. Initially only 175 soldiers and militia, the British expedition drew in volunteers and native warriors as it advanced. Arriving at Vincennes 500 strong, the local French population immediately switched allegiance. Most of the militia then dispersed, leaving only 90 to garrison the retaken Sackville. Clark moved from Kaskaskia to recapture.
Okay. Clark went to Kaskaskia. This is a good story. Goes to Kaskaskia, has some spies from his group go in, and they realize that the British have the fort there. And in Kaskaskia is French, American, Spanish, British, Native, and they're all living in peace and harmony, trading and just doing their thing. And they're so far away from the war that none of the thought is that the British haven't told them there's a war going on, if they know. But it doesn't seem like they know, because, like I say, they're so far away. And this right here, this is the Mississippi. So this is the Mississippi River, like all around here. So so he takes the fort at night. He sneaks in. They get into the fort, tell the British, okay, you know, war's on. I don't remember if the British knew, but I think they might have. He sends them up to Fort Detroit and to Williamsburg to get them out of there. But he needs people, because about this time he's hearing Fort Sackville's been taken over. Well, he needs more troops. So what he does is he turns the cannons from the fort and starts attacking outside of Kaskaskia, just bombarding it. And so the people in the town are thinking, oh my goodness, what did we do? The British are attacking us. What's going on? This goes on, I think, for several hours. Maybe even a day. I don't even remember now. Finally, the cannons stop. Some shots are fired. He rides into town, or runs into town, rides into town, I don't remember, telling everyone, the British have surrendered. I've taken over the fort. We are at war, and I could use your help. And the people are like, you saved our lives. Absolutely, we'll help. What can we do? And he's like, we have to go to Vincennes and take Fort Sackville back. And they're just like, you got it. He left out the part where he attacked them. Psychological warfare. He attacked them, while in that time the British were already being ushered out. They were gone when he turned the cannons on the town, purposely not trying to kill anyone, but making it seem like, oh my goodness, what's happening? And then rode into town as the hero and the savior, and then got them all to jump on board and head back to Sackville.
Capture Vincennes on February 6, 1779, with 170 men. He reached the fort on
January-February range. He's going through the Midwest. This is Illinois. Indiana border today is like right here. Okay? The Wabash River runs right along this fort. He's doing all this in winter, 170 men, and his second in command was the very last person. He said, if anyone falls even with you or step behind, shoot him. You're on board. You're on board. There is no giving up. There's no retreating. And this whole area flooded, by the way. And no fires allowed, because they'll know we're coming. So you're walking through a middle of winter in a frozen area, and you can't have fire. And not one person got sick or died on that trip. It's an amazing story.
February 23rd, forcing its surrender on the 25th.
Okay, so they're not going to get into it, so I will. They caught a scouting party of Native Americans who were in the fort with them. Caught a scouting party. Captured them, and then basically told the British to surrender the fort. And the British were like, nah, we're good. We're going to drink our iced tea. So, we're good, bro. And he was like, yeah, no, that's not how it works. So, he went ahead, and there are other natives in the fort. So he put them on their knees, took out a tomahawk, right in the back of the head of one of the natives. The other natives in the fort are like, okay, we can't let our people die. We got to do something. Let's surrender the fort. British are like, nah, we're busy. We're eating peanuts, so we got things to do. He goes one by one. I think there was 9 of them. I've also heard 3. So I don't know what the real number is. Goes right on down. The very last one was the chief of this tribe, he was a hunter, so he was out foraging with the people, scouting and foraging. Tomahawk right in the back of the head, and he's yelling at the British in the fort. Natives in the fort are singing like their death songs, they're crying. All of a sudden he gets tapped on the leg. He looks down. The native isn't dead. He pulled the tomahawk out of his head, cleaned his blood and skull off, and then took it by the handle and handed it back. So he took it by the blade and handed the handle back and tapped him with the handle so that he could finish him off. The rest of the soldiers were like, he realized it and immediately dispatched him. And the British were like, sorry, man, we got iced tea and peanuts, you know? Deuces. The next morning, they went ahead and decided to surrender. But that night, they threw the natives in the kind of stockyard prison so they wouldn't escape and then help Rogers' men come in. They released them the next morning, and Rogers and his men helped them load up the bodies and apologized to him profusely. This is what we wanted to do. And the natives basically said, we would have done the same thing. This is war. We're not even mad at you. We're mad at them. And they said, you'll never hear from us again. And I saw this at Fort Sackville because they do a little presentation. And I don't remember the tribe. And I think the tribe, it says, was lost to history in terms of they just left. It's a brutal story. George Rogers Clark, side note, is also the founder of Louisville, Kentucky. So if you're there, he's buried there as well. Might have turned traitor in his later years, but you know, we won't discuss that.
While Clark never had the manpower or supplies to threaten Detroit, the British would never challenge American control in Illinois, functionally conceding the western frontier. To continue following this series as the young United
Sorry, we're going to end it there. I talked a little bit too much, but, you know, I apologize. So, I hope you enjoyed it. I do. I did. Oh, sorry. Ow. Peanuts and iced tea. It's the way to live. So anyways, I hope you enjoyed it. I did. I'm going to knock out probably one more of these bad boys before I go to bed. So until I do, you have a good day. Have a good night.